Unit. Okay. So we briefly touched a little bit about Bevel on there. And when I was doing research and stuff, and after, reviewing and watching your videos, it was cool to go back to, because I remember watching those when I was first learning about knives, and now it's like 2 years later, 3 years later, whatever, and like I'm doing the same thing. So I was just like, trying to conglomerate all this information again. And I really wanted to stay away from talking about any specific angle numbers in my video, because I think that it's intimidating. It can get really confusing. I don't feel comfortable talking about it on like a crazy nerdy level like that. So I'm just curious, what I recommended in my video is that when talking about bevel, we talk more about ratio than angle. I want to ask you, maybe like just to clarify for me, sort of like what the relationship between angle and bevel might be, but I also don't know if I should just like stay away from that. We can just talk about it, I guess. But the importance of bevel and sort of, between a beefier 50-50, a mid-grade 70-30, and then of course your 90-10s. And I was also going to ask if you have a 90-10 that you can show the camera,
Totally.
because I don't have one. Just reaches right within. You don't even have to.
Yeah. Okay, so to not, I know that some of us chefs didn't do the best in math class, but I'm going to do a bit of I'm going to do a bit of a geometry kind of like visual, because it helps. And maybe you decide to throw something up on the screen, whether or not you do, it doesn't really matter. The bevel is side of the knife.
Mm-hmm.
Is kind of like your starting place, and you can see on this one very drastically where that bevel starts. It's that place where the shading changes. Sorry for everybody that's audio only, for the emulsion listeners. Then there's also the place where the knife is going to touch the board. That's like the edge. This, the kind of like the place between those 2 points is the bevel, often called the edge. Like in a lot of my videos, I would call it kind of like the blade is what I would call it in my videos, kind of to a fault. Like I had people commenting saying it's called a bevel, it's not called an edge, or the blade, it's not called the blade. Because I would say the blade side and the non-blade side often, just because that helped me think about it a little bit better. Mm-hmm. The way that you develop this is often called a shinogi. That's another thing that people will often say, and even on your kind of like non-exaggerated blades, you can see this, where as you're sharpening up and down the blade, you'll see this section that's like the side of the knife, and then the shinogi or the bevel. That's almost so. Depending on how wide the spine of the knife is, this is reasonably thick. If you have your UX10, it's going to be much thinner than this. The angle of the side of the blade down to where the knife meets the board or the edge, that's your angle. And so on this knife in particular, this side does not have a bevel. This side has almost 100% of the bevel. Like, and when I sharpen this, I'll kick up a little bit on this side, and that's why I use this as kind of like a 90-10 example, because I will kind of like form a little bit of a bevel on this side just to give this a little bit more heft, so it doesn't kind of curl over as much. But the reason that I talk about, everybody knows that your mandolin is probably like the sharpest object that you interact with on the most frequent basis when you're starting out in professional kitchens. And the reason for that is it is an example of that like heavily weighted ratio to one side of the blade. If you look at your mandolin, if you're playing along at home, and you flip the cover open and you look, you can see that there's like, it looks like a cross section of a Yanagi knife. Just kind of like inserted into this piece of plastic, and it's done in that way because it's you can get it incredibly sharp. If you ever look at like razors, like for the gentlemen out there who shave their face with like a single blade razor, those are also structured in that way because you can get the sharpest edge on a ratio that is more leaning towards keeping the bevel on one side of the blade. Mm-hmm. The reason that now, there's certain people who, they're browsing Korin or they're on JapaneseKnifeImports.com, and you might see that there's a bevel ratio, or sometimes it's called a blade ratio on certain knives where it goes away from that 50-50 edge. That 50-50 bevel ratio was popularized with like old school French and German knives, like those very European centric knives that were super thick, yeah, super beefy, and they were made that way because when you have equal support on either side, it's thicker, it's much less likely that it's going to curve one way or another, and that edge just holds up naturally longer over time. Now, there's certain people who look at that 50-50 edge and they look at the 90-10, and again, this is back to those trade-offs, right? Like back to the trade-offs on each one. And certain people say, well, I want the sharpness of the single bevel or the asymmetric bevel, the 90-10, but I want the the long-lasting edge capacity of, a more 50-50 edge. And so that's when you started to see people, and I'm going to bring my prop back, where they would say, what if I actually brought up a little bit more of an edge on my non-bevel side, and I actually made a bevel on this side? I don't recommend doing that with a knife like this because just the structure of it and the way that it's ground, you're really going to screw up the way that this knife feels by doing something like that. You're much better off going with something like this. So this is a Suisun Enox knife. This, I think, comes out of the box as an 80-20 bevel or 70-30 bevel, which is incredibly rare. Most knife makers won't do this for you because it just doesn't. If you don't know how to take care of a knife like this, and we're probably talking to the 10% of people who are actually going to deep dive into creating their own edge on these sorts of knives. And so what this knife does bevel wise is that there's a large percentage of the bevel here, but you do it super, you don't actually kick up that much of an edge on the opposing side of the knife. And so what that does is that gives you theoretically the best of both worlds, where you can get incredibly thin of an edge, and the knife has to be made to handle that type of adjustment. And you're not so skewed on having a single bevel where you're going to get through your second project on your board and you're going to be like, well, my edge is completely gone, And the other thing that I'll add is, like, if you're going to do these asymmetric edges, you have to be prepared. Like, your steel makeup has to be good enough to handle it. And if it's not, like, you'll know. I often tell the story of, like, when I started, I got it mixed up. I got it screwed up in my mind, where it's like I put the 60 on the 40 side, and then I put the 40 on the 60 side on all my knives.
Oh man!
And I had to go backwards. I had to switch it back the other way because I was like, oh, I totally did this wrong. And so I hope that's like a decent primer as far as bevels go. And that's why I talk about, like, that visual of draw the line from the side of the knife down. And then that's your starting point where you start to see that shinogi go. And then wherever that, and this is so microscopically small that most of us don't actually visualize this. And so talking about angles, like, that's the angle by which you need to press it on the stone and then go with it. That's difficult to articulate to people because we're on this knife specifically, we're talking about, like, on the bevel side, it's about 1 millimeter. And on the on the lesser of the ratio, it's like 1/3 of a millimeter, man. And so it's like, you never get down that close to the knife, look underneath the stone, and you can't, you don't see those things. And so that's why I suggest people to do my trick with the pennies, right, where you put a couple of coins, whatever currency you're using. I know you have a global audience, so you use that as a base, and that flicks your knife up. Usually at, and this is, like, heavily debated, and it changes every single knife. People say that, you'll start with, like, a 15-degree angle. And if you kind of, like, again, think geometry, 15 degrees is pretty shallow. 90 degrees is obviously, like, straight up, right? And then you do your 45-degree angle. That's a little bit too harsh. Most people generally say that there's between 15 and 25 degrees is about where you want to be for sharpening angles. And again, this is incredibly contextual. Don't make it, like, I would say blanket statements are tricky to make because, you might have a super thick boy, if you're sharpening a Deba, that almost feels like, on the bevel side, it feels like a 45-degree angle. Like, it's so thick, like, you're so up on the edge. Yeah,
One
and then
giant.
if you're talking about like if you're talking about this guy, you know, when I'm on the non-bevel side, like I'm near flat against the stone. You know, like I'm near flat, like not to a point where I'm scratching the side of the knife, but it's like I'm pretty flat, you know, so that's less than 15 degrees in theory. And so it's like how do you tell someone a proper angle that you need to use every single time when it changes every single knife blade, which is part of the challenge and part of the reason why I'm so glad that, you know, like reason I wanted to put out educational content, reasons I'm happy you're putting out educational stuff, because you don't want the click a button and do it. You want to actually develop knowledge. You know what I mean?
You need to
Um,
like get a whole idea of all these concepts and put them together over. But that does take time. And the reason I wanted to make this video is to give, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, people a starting place. And it's hard because I feel like to get your start, I kind of want to share these easy to conceptualize blanket sort of ideas behind what the techniques that I'm sharing to make it more digestible for the beginner. You know what I mean?
totally.
But I know through this conversation, talking with you through my own research, that it goes a lot deeper than that. And I continuously mention that throughout the video. I hope my knife nerds out there will spare me a little bit, but also I don't give a shit. So can I swear? Can I swear? Can I
Yeah,
swear?
1000%.
So, yeah, 100%. So come at me. But I think overall that this video it's been coming together. I mean, I was just sitting down and editing it a bit before hopping on this call with you and trying to put together what I want to talk about. And I don't know what that's going to be yet. So I'm glad we're just kind of hitting everything because
Well,
I
it's
want to weave you in somewhere where it makes sense.
Yeah, I want to give you as much
So
footage as possible. The last thing that I'll add on angles really quickly is that I don't know if you've come across those like machines that set the angle for you in your research. There's ones that you know
no,
you clip your knife into this machine. It's like a mechanical arm, and based on how you set the arm, that sets your angle for that specific side of the knife.
I
And
feel like I've seen that. Those they attach to your counter.
exactly,
They're
exactly.
so weird. They're
Yeah,
so
they're
bizarre.
yeah, and what's weird is it's not completely horizontal. You know, a lot of
Uh,
these do like vertical, you know, passes on a stone or whatever mechanism they use.
right.
And what it can do is it can be if you have a UX10, a 240 millimeter Misono UX10, and you take it out of the box, and the person at the store tells you this is the angle that you need to set on this machine with this grit, and this is the pressure and whatever. Like it's very, very like it's an algorithm, right? Like they're giving you the rules of the algorithm. You can put that knife into that machine, and you can bust out the same exact angle every single time you use that machine. Now, if that
Cool.
works for you and that's what you want to do, it's going to be an amazing tool for you. The issue that I
Definitely.
have with it is that the second that tool gets removed, or you get called to do a guest chef dinner in Houston or Atlanta or San Francisco, and you don't have your fancy thing, and your knife, you know, gets completely beat to shit, and you can't seem to use a stone, you have no conceptual knowledge of how the angle of that knife works. And so it almost feels like, you know, call it like Tesla autopilot, or call it, like too much
Very
simulation
cool.
driving, or too much, someone driving it for you. And I don't feel like you actually get learn. It's incredibly effective. Like it's
It's the same
consistent
reason
every
why
single time. Yeah,
it's the same reason why you like want to learn probably to knead by hand before you start using the stand mixer. You know,
exactly.
you want to feel for what you're doing so that when you use that stand mixer, that efficient tool that is so amazing that I use all the time, you know what you're looking for. You know how it feels without touching it.
Yep.
So,
And if you don't know how
yeah.
to calibrate your edge on machines like that, it can really be harmful. And the last thing I'll add, because I know we want to move on, is that you'll often see those clip-on angle adjusters for knives sometimes.
Yeah.
That can work great. The issue that I have with it is sometimes it can beat up your stone if you're not used to figuring out where the angle happens to be, and you push that angle finder thing into your stone, you'll dig up like a scratch in your stone. And that's pretty harmful, number one. So that's why I like the pennies, because you set your angle, you figure out where the muscle memory is, you take the pennies off the stone, and then that's where you keep your finger going back and forth.